My name is Rick Gatewood, and I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, so this is definitely not a Mid-Coast presentation. This is a Mid-South presentation. I meet the technical specification for from away. Friend of mine who was born in Germany, we were talking about that one time, and he said he asked a good friend of his down in Camden, how long do you have to live in Maine to be considered not from away? And his friend said, well, let me tell you a story. He said there was an obituary in the Camden newspaper for a lady that passed away in her early 90s. The obituary read, while from away, she moved here at the age of 7 months with her parents. Does that answer your question? A lot of the stuff that I'm going to cover in this talk, it was sort of suspected, but not verifiable because, as we were talking, the vital statistics in southern and midwestern states were sorely lacking up until well into the 1920s. Some states did not even require anything until 1910, and some didn't even, some death certificates didn't even get done in the 20s, as we'll find out. But computerization has brought a new window to those of us who live down south, because if you're lucky enough for your relatives to live in a place that had an active newspaper and that newspaper got digitized, sometimes you'll find that, depending on the newspaper, it was almost like Facebook. And that's what really made this possible. So first of all, just a little bit about the pandemic. When it hit in 1918, it seemed to affect mostly young people. They're not really sure why. They think that there was an earlier strain of this in the 1870s, 1880s. And so a lot of older people had immunity. But tracking it back, they have discovered that it started out in early 1918 with a very mild version. But then when it came back in the fall, that's when all the deaths started to happen. It got distributed throughout the country and into Europe by virtue of the fact that it occurred while World War I was still in progress. And a lot of people have heard it referred to as the Spanish flu. The reason why it's called the Spanish flu is Spain was the only country that would acknowledge having it, because all the other combatants didn't want to admit that they had it because they didn't want the enemy to know. It seems that from tracking it back, that in January, February, the first cases were reported by this doctor in southwestern corner of Kansas. Some people think it might have been a strain of the swine flu that occurred in pigs, transmitted to humans, but it's almost assuredly started in Kansas and transferred from there when people were when the United States entered World War I and soldiers were called up. There was a big camp, big fort in Kansas at Camp Funston, where a lot of people were inducted before they were sent to Europe. I mean, soldiers from Camp Funston, they went They went all across the United States. They went to Europe. And unfortunately, they went on leave too. So you can imagine what that did. They took it right back home. This is the overflow ward at Camp Funston. And here's my parents and grandparents. I only had the one grandparent when I was growing up, and she could tell me some things about her family, but not much about my father's family, my grandfather's family, because my grandfather didn't talk about his family. And my mother was orphaned when she was a teenager in foster care, so she did not know much about her parents. And my dad, he knew from his grandmother and grandparents on the Cranford side, but he did not know anything about the Gatewood side. So here's the regional geography. The epicenter of what we're going to talk about today is Cooter. There's only one Cooter in the entire country, and that's it. And it was named for the Coutret family of New Madrid. And you notice I say New Madrid. If you say New Madrid, they'll know you're from away. And do we have anybody that's a natural disaster, into natural disasters? Can tell me what happened right here? This is where New Madrid, Missouri is, right at that oxbow. In 1911, there was a huge earthquake. It's the biggest natural disaster to ever hit North America in recorded history. And the town dropped 20 feet, and the river ran backwards for 3 days and made this lake. They heard the noise in Washington, D.C. and New York. And there were tremors for an entire year. So the big question about this whole region is, when is that baby going to go again? It's an earthquake. That's what they're still trying to figure out. They don't know. They still don't really know why. But I just thought, I didn't know if there'd be anybody that was into earthquakes. But anyway, this section of Missouri is referred to the Bootheel. You can probably see why. And the way people moved in the South was basically the same as it was everywhere. They tended to go west. My Gatewood family went from Virginia to North Carolina, and then when the Chickasaw Cherokee were removed from this area in the 1830s, they moved up here to what was Weakley, Tennessee. The Cranford family, my grandmother, came from up around Columbia, Tennessee, moved up here to this part, the most northwestern part of Tennessee. They came from a place appropriately called Cranford Hollow. My Vansel relatives came via Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri. So they went that way. All converging, everything converging, but my family converging between here and here. My grandfather did not have a happy childhood, and he and his brother were quick to want to get out of Weakley County. So what they did was they went west. And there were a lot of people that went across the river Has anybody ever been on I-55 through this part of Arkansas, Missouri? Well, it's pretty much flat until you get up to about here. And if you go through there today, you'll see lots of soybeans and lots of rice paddies. But at one time, it was all old growth forest, and there was huge lumbering in the late 1800s, or right up to the early 1900s. And my grandfather Cranford, he was 6 years old when his father moved him up here to this part of Tennessee. But at some point, he decided to take his family over here into Missouri, and they ended up in Cooter. Somewhere along the way, my grandfather Gatewood, who was working in the lumber business, met my grandmother, and they lived in Cooter for a while. But my grandfather decided he did not want to be a farmer, and that's why he moved to Memphis. Here is the Bootheel. Pemiscot is where most of the story, today's story, takes place. My mother also grew up in Cape Girardeau. Here's my grandfather and his brother Lee when they were still doing the lumber business. This is a picture taken at a mill in Arkansas. And like I said, he decided to leave the country, move to the city, and go to work for the streetcar company. And he managed to retire from there. And of course, the streetcars were all bought up by General Motors after the war. So he didn't live to see that. My grandfather and grandmother had 5 children that survived, 2 that did not survive due to childhood illnesses. See a trend here: George Gatewood, George Richard Gatewood, George Richard Gatewood. Whoops, did I skip one? Yep. Now this is the Cranford side, my grandmother, her parents, and she had 3 other siblings besides her older brother. Frank is the person we want to talk about next. Frank married Lucille Wilson, also known as Lou. One of the things that's interesting when you look at the newspapers from this time, both Hayti, Missouri and Caruthersville, Missouri had newspapers that had social correspondence that were always telling things that were going on. From what they say, I have to infer that Lou died of TB. I'm pretty sure. Well, Frank, after a couple of years after Lou died, he married Anila Sands. She was a friend of Lou, so they knew each other before. They had 3 children. In 1915, 1 boy. March 1918, twins. And here we see the notice in the newspaper. My grandmother's younger brother, Ode, he happened to be the right age to be called up in the draft. And in July, there was a huge long list in the newspaper of men that were called up to go to Camp Funston. He was on that list. November 14th, 1918, he's home on leave, but notice, he's stricken down with the flu Well, he survived the flu. And in 1919, he was discharged. War being over, they discharged guys like crazy. Well, here we get to 14th of November, 1918, and it's the same day that the newspaper reported that Ode Cranford was ill with the flu. We find out that his brother Frank is one of many to die. Not only did Frank die, but two of his three children, his oldest son and one of the twins. We've never been able to learn when the children died. There were so many people dying that we were fortunate they're even mentioned in the newspaper. The Mrs. Bud Ayers that's listed up there at the top was my father's first cousin. And here we see at the bottom Frank Cranford and two of his children. So his wife Anila and one daughter, she changed her name from Janetta to Jeanette. My cousin asked her why. She said, because I didn't like it. And here's Anila with Jeanette. Anila met my grandfather, William Vansel, and they were married in 1919. In the short time that they were together, they had 4 children. The oldest, and my mother, Anna Kathleen, and her sister were twins. You notice a trend here? Anila had twins twice. Her mother was a twin. And my mother and her sisters used to scare all the women in the family to death, telling them they were going to have twins. Because it runs in the family. The youngest ended up being adopted. She went to live in Texas. Unfortunately, Anila died in 1927, and even at this late date, there's still no death certificate. The family story is that she died of cancer, but we don't really know that for sure. William lived on until 1936. He was about 10 or 12 years older than Anila. But he had high blood pressure, and as we know, it wasn't until well after World War II that there was good treatment for high blood pressure, and that was often a cause for congestive heart failure. The unfortunate thing was that when she died, my mother said that they carried on for a while, but in those days, they wouldn't let a single man raise kids by themselves, and so the state came and took them away and put them in an orphanage and then in foster homes. So you can see why she doesn't know much about her family. So this explains why I can tell people that my mother's sister was my father's cousin. And they look at me funny when I say that. So when I was looking all this up, as I said, there weren't very many records. If you're fortunate enough sometimes you can find marriage records, marriage license records. There are property records out there if you can find them, but they're very difficult to find. I'm really glad to see that Family Search is starting to put they're starting to use AI to index some of their records. And I have found more on my father's family using that than anything else. But my brother-in-law, being eagle-eye, noticed that William had appeared one prior time in the census in 1910, and it showed him as divorced. And we're going, divorced? My mother and her sisters didn't know that he'd been married before. So we started looking, and we found that he was married to a woman named Pearl Stella Hall in 1903. And by sometime in the late 19 teens, they were divorced. And here we have in the census, 1910, she's remarried, and we've never been able to figure out who that is, who her husband was. But lo and behold, there's a Marion Vansel and a Ralph Vansel that were my mother and father's half siblings that we never even knew existed. Marion actually turned out to be fairly easy to track because she stayed in Missouri and got married. But Ralph took the surname of his mother's next husband, Ralph Armstrong. You know how many Ralph Armstrongs there are? And once again, the newspaper won. The last record I had of him was when he registered for World War II. And we found this article in the newspaper, and even though the birth date doesn't match up, down at the bottom, it has his sister, Marion Lloyd of East St. Louis, of St. Louis, and that's what tipped us off that it was our Uncle Ralph that nobody knew existed. So not only did were we able, using the newspaper.com, were we able to figure out what happened that caused our grandmother Anila to remarry. We also found out that we had other family that nobody knew about. That's all I have. It's just a simple story. Finding it was the problem. I'm thankful for the fact that the Caruthersville and Hayti newspapers had social columns.
I think it's interesting because a lot of newspapers had those. I mean, the ones around here did as well. You know, so-and-so went to visit her sister Marion. Yes.
Yes. That's very much so.
How did you access those newspapers?
Well, that's newspapers.com is affiliated with Ancestry, and it's an add-on to your Ancestry subscription. And I used to have it a long time ago when I first started using Ancestry, and I quit using it because I didn't find that much useful, but they keep adding newspapers all the time. And if you're lucky, they'll add something that's useful for you. I don't know what the deal is in Weakley County, Tennessee, where my grandfather came from. I have not been able to find any digitized newspapers from there. I don't know if they didn't have any, or if they didn't have any until after the 1900s, or if they just haven't been digitized. But just across the river in Pemiscot County, they had not only one, but two active newspapers.
I also really liked your map. It was visually very easy to look at and appealing. How did you come up with that?
I got it online. It's just a screenshot. Yeah.
Do you know how much newspapers.com, I keep getting that from Ancestry and I just,
Sometimes they'll have promotional prices, but I think it's about $50 or $60 add-on.
I think it's every 6 months though.
Yeah, it's every 6 months. Yeah.
So it's almost like, I'm sure you know what you need to look up.
Well, you know, it's a good thing to have in the winter. You know.
That was using newspapers.com when they added the newspaper for my family's, the town where my family lived, that I could do the whole story about the basketball team. And it was only because I found stuff on but and if you belong, every month or so they'll send you a list of all the new newspapers they've added.
Yeah, they do. They keep adding newspapers. You know.
20 or 30 new newspapers by area. And the last few months I've looked and they've been, you know, and I'm making this up, like Czechoslovakia and some place in the Midwest where no member of my family ever been.
Yeah, the chances of it being where your family is, you know, may be slim, but they keep adding them.
I'm looking for just a year.
Yep.
After the librarian try to, you know, an eyeball search and just, you know, little article like this you'd never find.
Right.
And the newspapers.com indexing is a little iffy.
Yeah, you have to kind of finagle it sometimes.
That's silly question. What about the Library of Congress? Aren't they supposed to be good for a good source for newspapers?
I don't know that they have.
They do. So the Library of Congress has newspapers on their website. Part of their Chronicling America project. It's like co-funded with the Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. So basically what happens with that is libraries send in their microfilm and then they just put it on their website. So for Maine, the Maine State Library is the partner. So like, for example, right now we have 2 rolls of film for smaller papers that we have sent to them and then they sent to them. So yeah, so they look to their partners for in certain grant rounds, they look for different things. For this last grant round, they're looking specifically at newspapers that are not in English. So Franco-American, it would be Maine newspapers, and also extremely limited runs that are not in other places, that are not sort of well documented elsewhere. So the ones that we have, I don't even know the names of them. They were 2 small runs that they only, you know, they just ran for like 2 years at a time in the 1970s.
I know that the Knoxville Museum sent a couple of, or some Waldo County newspaper that literally ran for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
I know they had asked for the Progressive Age, and the one that they wanted, we didn't have it in the museum, but.
Yeah, I think they asked me about that too, and we didn't have it either. Yeah, so they continue to put stuff on their site. But I think a lot of libraries and a lot of historical societies are sort of looking to like digitize on their own too. There's more funding that's available for it. I feel right now, people are paying more attention to it. Like we've digitized film of the journal, you know, that is not on the Library of Congress site.
That's the journal, you have to look at about 4 different places to get all these years.
Yeah. So yes.
Yeah, one of the frustrating thing that I ran into with my grandfather, Gatewood's family, Weakley County, like in large part of Western Tennessee, they hardly had any newspapers until after the turn of the century. And the only time that you could get any news from there is if it happened to be picked up in the Memphis paper or a paper in Kentucky.
What year was it that the state said the kids had to leave the father and the
It was after her mother died in the I don't remember how old she was when she went to the orphanage, but her mother died after the last sister in 27.
1927.
Mhm.
So they were still doing, I'm just amazed because I ran into a relative, but this is back in Massachusetts, and this was in the late 1600s, and I knew they were doing that then. But to know that they were doing it in 1900.
Yeah, my mother has memories of being in the orphanage and being out on the playground and her father coming to the fence and just crying, because they were in the orphanage.
I wonder if that was a state by state law at that time.
It's hard to say. It might have been up to the social workers, I don't know. Who knows? But my father lost his father as a teenager, and my mother lost her father as a teenager. And of course, her mother died when she was 5. So she was foster child. It's interesting. The reason why she met my father is because he was her sister's cousin. That's basically how they met. Family connection. All due to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. That's where they believe it went from there to the rest of the world.
I read a book, I think it was called Laughing in the Jungle by Louis Adams. And he was a Slovenian immigrant, a writer, and he came and he wrote about his adventures in America, and he joined the U.S. Army shortly before the war. So like 1916, 17, he was, in the Army. And I don't believe it was in Missouri. I thought it was a camp in Kansas where the flu swept through the camp, and he described his job every morning as going through the big tent and carrying out the body.
Yeah. It just so happened that, like I said, that they think that somebody that had this flu came from somewhere there, probably southwestern Kansas, where the first episodes were reported. They happened to report to duty at this camp.
So is this to suggest that what we call the Spanish flu actually originated in the United States?
They are pretty. Everything points to that. Looking back on it over the past 100 years, that's what the conclusion that they've come to. Yeah. Well, the fact that the first really large number of cases occurred in Kansas leads them to believe that it occurred there because of the reported cases that the doctor in southwestern Kansas found. And then, of course, those people went to other bases before they went to Europe.
The Spanish flu was raging in American military camp, and they were wanting to get the men onto a ship and send them to Europe. And I know that there was a big fight between the War Department and the medical people and the president, who wanted to slow down the transport of civilian transporting disease. They did, I think,
slow it down a little bit, and they also limited the number of, men per square or whatever on the ship that on the pier. But nonetheless, I have wondered myself if you found any evidence, any more evidence that it was indeed who began here in the United States. And
that's what their theory is now. That's all I could find is from what they've been able to.
There was a big surge in the spring of deaths, and then like quiet during the winter and summer, and then it came back fiercely in October and November of 1918.
Yeah, the fall was particularly bad.
Does anyone know the incubation?
It was quick.
Exposure to.
It was quick. It was quick. I think that I read, descriptions where the person could be well in the morning and dead in the afternoon.
I remember.
Yeah, it was quick. It was very, very fast.
I remember there was a case, I forgot now what city it was. They had some soldiers returning. I want to say Philadelphia, but it could have, they wanted to have a parade. And the public health officials warned them not to.
Right.
And they did it anyway, and
Just dropped dead.
they had another surge of deaths.
Dropped dead. My mother, always told me rather morbid stories as a child. She told me the family stories of how people died, and she said that they could tell that it was a Spanish flu because the person's neck and face turned black. It had hemorrhaging in the lungs.
I hadn't heard that, but I knew they basically drowned. Yeah.